Welcome to the DRF Sports Podcast, brought to you by DRF Sports. America's most trusted name in horse racing is now providing sports bettors with exclusive data, analytics, previews, videos, and expert picks on all major sports. Bet smarter and have more fun doing it. It's the DRF Sports Podcast, and now your host, Sheldon Alexander. Ready, set, bet.
This is the DRF Sports Podcast, episode 14. Make sure you like and follow wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Sheldon Alexander. A reminder, we do this twice a week. On Tuesdays, we recap the week that was, and on Fridays, it's the Picks Pod. Now, luckily for me, week 6 in the NFL ended with the Titans' upset victory over the Bills. But it was still a losing week for me with the picks, so it's very good that I have my guy Matt Russell coming back to break it all down with me. And on top of that, a good reminder to check out drf.com/sports, because that's where you can get all of the details, insights, including our power trends, line movements, team stats, and even more betting angles, including Scott Gramling's in-depth game previews, plus his weekly six-pack in both the NFL and NCAA. So much great information there. Make sure you go to drf.com/sports. That's where you need to be every single day for all of the game previews. Plus, we go in depth in all of the games on this podcast. Also, with the NBA season set to tip off, make sure you check out our NBA season betting preview. We've got all the market watch on futures, from MVP to division winners to who's going to win the NBA title, coach of the year, all that and more. Make sure you check us out before the NBA season tips off. We're right here at the start of the season. That, again, like and subscribe to this, the DRF Sports Podcast, wherever you get your podcast. Basically, however you want your betting information, we've got you covered. drf.com/sports. But as mentioned on today's show, I need a little bit of a pick-me-up. So our guy Matt Russell is back to help me get right. We're going to recap what just happened over the weekend in some crazy football action. But also, there's a bunch of games taking place midweek. We've got your picks covered. And luckily for you, that pod starts right about now. Well, we always knew there'd be weeks like this. I had a massive blow-up week, but I'm still confident, I'm still ready for a bounce back. And hey, at least we can say we ended week 6 on a high note with the Titans' outright victory over the Bills. Plus, I get to speak to my dude, Mr. Matt Russell. How you doing, man?
What's up, man? I'm all right. I didn't have as much of a blow-up week. I'm sorry to hear that. Honestly, I was pretty much dead even. It was just kind of one of those weeks where you're moving stuff around. And yeah, we caught maybe a little bit lucky, however you want to sort of frame it, with the Titans and the Titans money line yesterday. And I think for the first time in my life, so a couple of different things. For me, it was actually a really low volume NFL Sunday. I didn't have as much going as I normally do. Part of that obviously feels a little low volume because we had 2 games, if you will, 4 teams on bye, so 2 less games than we normally do. But I didn't play the Thursday night game, which we talked about last week, but like Denver, Las Vegas, I didn't really want anything to any part of that, because who wants to lay that many points with Denver, and who wants to back Vegas and all of that sort of thing. Green Bay and Chicago, like eventually I just kind of like backed my way Homer Simpson style into the hedge on that game. So it's kind of avoiding that. But for the first time in my life, I look at my ledger for NFL Sunday, and I lost exactly $1. Like after everything that shook down, right? And you're like, who knows? You sort of lose track or whatever, but you're pouring. And like, if you're anybody else, right? I'm recommending like create your own spreadsheet, like use an app, all of that sort of thing. But like I get through and it's like, okay, Titans money line, boop, 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 doo, doo, doo. And it's like, -1, like exactly $1. So we paid $1 for a lot of entertainment this past Sunday and Monday, of course.
And Monday. Speaking of that Monday entertainment, the Titans, as mentioned, beating the Bills. And the one thing, I was actually all over in week 6, but more importantly, you were also on the Titans. So how did this one play out in your eyes?
I listen, it's funny. It literally is funny. Like I tweeted out yesterday, like football is just the funniest game, right? Because you're watching that game and like, you're sitting there where you have Titans +6. I managed to get a +7 in there as well. And, obviously some money line. And so you're watching the game and it's just all Buffalo, right? And they're just marching it up and down the field for that first quarter and early second quarter. But the red zone, and you and I talk about like the concept of defense in 2021, and it isn't just like, oh man, like shut them down, like they can't move the ball. Like defense is now creating turnovers and red zone defense, right? Holding teams to field goals. Because honestly, when you get a field goal now, it just feels like you didn't do anything, because it's just like, that's just the way the NFL is now. And so they, the Bills go down, they get a couple of field goals. They've got, a billion plays to like 4 plays for Tennessee. And then it's like, okay, it's 6-0. Feels like you're just an absolute fool for ever fading this Bills team, even though the scoreboard still only says 6-0. And then Derrick Henry just pops one off, man. And then he's just running down the field, and you're just laughing. You're like, Tennessee has made one play all day. And that includes defensively. I mean, suppose they made a couple of plays to keep the Bills out of the end zone in that first sort of 20 minutes of the game, but it's 7-6. And you're just like, okay, like this is how this stuff happens, right? Like whether it's late game shenanigans with like the Eagles and the Bucks last week, or this, you're just like, yeah, as you say, right? Just take the points, right? Like that's kind of the default move, because just like the weirdest stuff happens. And if you had told me before the game that like the Titans were going to have somebody get injured basically on every play, and they were going to be down to their absolute last defensive back, and that Josh Allen would just throw at that guy the entire second half, and that the Titans would somehow win, I'd be like, you're crazy. But that being said, at halftime, the Titans are down 3 points, and they're plus 300 on the money line live at halftime. So I'm like, you know what? I'll take a shot on that too, because, we're already here. And it just feels like that weird type of a situation, right? And so, it's not really that explainable as far as like how this stuff happens, because you're sitting there watching the game going like, Buffalo's going to be fine, right? And they probably win that game if Josh Allen doesn't slip and all that sort of thing. But you're just like, laying points, man. Like it's just so not worth it in my mind. Like I understand that, and listen, this week was certainly indicative of this, but like teams are going to cover point spreads. I just don't know how they do it in the NFL, because it's just, there's so much that has to go right for you to cover any sort of significant number in the NFL or football in general these days. There's just too much going on and too much weird stuff that can happen.
Totally agree with you there, man. It was super interesting. Another thing that was super interesting is I see this stat here that says NFL teams with 70% plus of the betting tickets this season, 16-6 against the spread. Last 2 weeks, 7-0 against the spread. The public is having their way. That is a tweet from the Action Network. Now, I ask you, for those who might not be familiar with this whole the public and what's going on with the public having a good week, what does that mean to a dude like you, my dude?
It's usually not great. Like we talked about it last week, right? Where they had a big week. They had a bigger week, right? And like, there's a concept out there, like you don't just fade the public all the time, right? And a lot of that is just kind of nonsense, because not every game is created equal from a betting ticket percentage and a money ticket percentage, et cetera, right? But as you and I talked about, there's kind of 2 or 3 games per week, and a lot of them are in prime time, where just by nature, right? If everybody is on one side, there is going to be value created on that opposing side. Now, again, the sportsbooks aren't just going to go absolutely nuts. They could have very easily made Buffalo -7.5, right? But Tennessee money would have come pouring in. And for all the Joe Public $100 bettors out there, right? It takes 100 of those to get up to a certain amount, whereas that certain amount can be bet by one guy. Right. Exactly. And then that's evened out. Right. So that's why these things never kind of get out of hand, because that big money is always kind of keeping things in check. And so there's, sort of a concept or there's there's different sports books. Right. And, there are sharp sports books and there are not so sharp sports books, because they limit people and only sort of recreational bettors can get in there. Right. And there was a case yesterday where in the quote unquote sharper sports book, Buffalo was -6. Okay. And then in the more recreational sports book, Buffalo was -7. And that existed all throughout the day. So you could bet Buffalo -6 and Tennessee +7 all throughout the day and just hope that it landed with Buffalo, landing 6 or 7, etc. So the point is that like, that's kind of the indicator a lot of the times, right? You can use a sports book that, as long as you know like what their clientele is, what their maximum limits are, you can use that information to kind of figure out what side is the public versus the, quote unquote sharp side or non-public side. And there isn't necessarily one or the other, right? Sometimes the public's on one team and then the sharp money, if you will, just doesn't have any interest in that game, in the same way that sometimes public has no interest in a 1 o'clock game and the sharp money happens to like that, right? Like there's so many variables that you can't just use go by one rule. Like I, on Sunday, made a last minute judgment call to bet on the Rams because the number got down to -7. And with, that was, do you think that was public money necessarily coming in on the Giants in a big way? I don't think so, right? So there was a fading of that kind of sharp money concept, right? For you, it just has to make sense to you, right? Like, does this line move make sense? Can you make that case? And when it came to like the Giants, for example, it's like, I don't really understand why this money's coming in. Like they have no players, right? Like Daniel Jones is still alive, but he's never good at home. Like that's by far one of the weirdest circumstances in all of sports. And so you just go, okay, like I'm going to hold my nose here and lay 7.5 points here with the Rams and hope it works out. And in that case, it did. And so, at the end of the day, right? Like whether it's the, stats like that or like the worst NFL better, having a big day, like these are just sort of the things that exist. And that's what makes people confident about the NFL, right? Everybody thinks they can beat the NFL. And yet it beats because of these two type, weeks, and might be the same thing for week 3, but over a long period of time, right? If you can get the best of the number, if you can get an extra half point here, an extra point there, a key number here, a key number there, like you're going to be successful. And it doesn't really matter what the sort of betting percentages are, but like that is one of the elements that creates value, right? Like you can't deny that that's the case. And so a couple of games here and there last night, I think was certainly the case because I don't think the Bills should have ever really been 6.5, and certainly not 7-point favorites at any point in time because that Tennessee Titans team just scrappy enough to get it done.
It's so funny about, just talking about the public and public perception and how that affects numbers and bets. So obviously like I post my full picks on social media, right? Like just follow along for the season. I'm trying to make picks for every single game, which is different than making bets on every single game. But it's funny because you have the people that will troll, and someone messaged me and they're like, how did you take the Texans? Like, that's such a crazy bet, blah, 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 blah. Like, how could you take the Texans to cover the 10 points? And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, well, they're a terrible team and blah, blah. I'm like, they're actually 3-3 against the spread this season.
Right. Well, that's what the point spread's for, right?
Do you know what I mean?
I'm impressed that he was able to contact you because he, got Wi-Fi from his private island that he used because obviously he bet on the Colts -10 for all of the world's money. Like, I get a kick out of it. At this podcast, and let me just get on my high horse for a sec. Like, this podcast is free. My content over at The Score is free. And like, you get into the comment section and like,
it's funny, like, man. It's hilarious.
Wrong. And you're like, like this whole thing, you can express your opinion in the form of wagering. Right? Like, first of all, it's free. Second of all, it's good. We win, right? Over the long term, more than we lose. And it's free. Like, agree, disagree, but like, why comment? Right? If you disagree, like that's what the money's for. Like, just go and bet it. This isn't like some secret thing that like nobody can do. Like, everybody can do it. Just go bet it and then like text me from your private island. But like, if you don't, then you can't tell me after the fact that it was such a terrible call. That's what the point spread is for, right? That is the great equalizer.
But that's why I just found it so funny because it was just like, how can you be betting on the Texans? I'm like, how can you be betting on Carson Wentz to lay 10 points? I mean, what are we talking about right now? Right. I'm like, okay, sure. I'm like, I'm just having to pick one side or the next. And that's where it is. Right. But what I meant though, by that whole point is just the perception of it all, because I was like, against the spread, they're better than the Chiefs. Yeah. And when you say that to someone who's just like the recreational bettor, they're like, oh, wait a second. Right. So this is why I enjoy doing this pod, because I'm learning the same way as we continue to do this. And that's what I hope to bring to the viewer as well, to teach them some certain ways. But one thing that was really huge that, maybe the biggest lesson of it all is sometimes it's just football. And I say that because there's a huge back and forth affair between the Cowboys and Pats. Now, the Cowboys win by 6 in OT to cover a 3.5 point spread. And why are beats like this so bad? I mean, I'm just asking for a friend.
Right. Sure.
In theory, if someone was on the Pats.
Yeah. Yeah, well, listen, like my -1 in my ledger for this week would have been a lot different, right? If the Patriots cover and certainly if they win, because as we talk about, I had a money line, I had a +3.5, all of that sort of thing, right? And so just the sequence of events that had to happen in order to get that game to overtime. And then obviously in overtime where like a guy is getting, illegal hands to the face on a pass. And it's like, that's at the very least pass interference, or I guess technically the very least illegal hands to the face for a 5-yard penalty and automatic first down. And it's like, that's the, again, we always talk about it, man, like the razor's edge, right? It's like a lot of times that gets called. And maybe you say it's a 50-50 call, maybe say it's a 60-40 call one way or another, but either way, like it's pretty close either way. And, just based on the fact that whether it gets called or not. And if it gets called, maybe the Patriots go down and they get a field goal, right? And then a Cowboys touchdown still wins it, but they end up covering. And that's after we talk about, Mac Jones interception when the Patriots really just need like a first down or two to kill all the clock. Yeah. Then, the 2-point conversion after the Bourne touchdown. And like, that's a 50-50 play that if that's a 1-point Patriots, lead, then the Cowboys could win the game with, by 2 points and cover the spread. I mean, the point is there's a lot going on there. And like, a lot had to happen for the Cowboys to win that by 6. But that's the thing, right? Like, the number opens 4. The general public, all you hear is like, well, the Cowboys are going to kill the Patriots. They're so much better. Like the Cowboys are fantastic because they beat up on Philly, Carolina, and the Giants without Daniel Jones in the second half, right? Like that's what their reputation is getting built upon. Yeah. And so, and what people don't understand, like a road game against the Patriots is a lot different than those 3 games. And so people pile in and the line comes down. And the line comes down from 4 to 3.5, right? Which tells you the big money, these quote unquote sharper money, et cetera, right? And we talked about this last week. My number was like Dallas -1.5. So I certainly wasn't saying like the Patriots are definitely going to win or that like they had, that they should be favored or anything along those lines. It's just like, the number can't be over 3. Like it should not be over 3. And if it is over 3, we're going to bet it. And then whatever happens, right? Yeah. And that happened. And so that's what, when you talk about like the public sort of getting all of the breaks, at least in that first, the first 2 windows of Sunday, certainly wasn't the case for Sunday Night Football, but like, you just kind of shrug your shoulders and go like, that stuff's going to happen. And like, we dodge bullets a lot of the times because, games go to overtime, where we are on the +3.5, because by nature, that's where we find a lot of the value in those, not necessarily a touchdown favorite or touchdown underdogs, but more than a field goals. And you go, okay, we win on a touchdown for us. We win on a field goal for us. We win on a field goal for them, but we lose on a touchdown for them. Doesn't mean it was the wrong side, right? Yeah. And like, if you're sitting there going like Cowboys had it the whole way, or like, what a dumb play, you get a message from somebody saying like, how could you take the Patriots? It's like, did you watch the game? Like everything had to go your way for that to end up being, a cover in the end, certainly the second half and overtime.
Speaking of overtime, though, there was another game that went to overtime that very few might have anticipated. And that's the Steelers needing 2 massive plays from TJ Watt to win by 3 in overtime against Geno Smith and the Seahawks. That was like, as my weekend progressed and just watching my NFL Sunday bets just like flop, this was just funny to like sit and watch, because I'm like, Geno Smith is balling out here, like, and he's not, but he was doing enough.
Right. Yeah.
To just like be like, oh, of course, this is what's going to happen. Right. What was your takeaway from that game? Because also there was a survivor pick as well. Yeah, so a lot on the line there. And again, TJ Watt making big boy plays to win that game.
Yeah. And let's take people behind the curtain here a little bit, right? You and I are co-shareholders in a survivor entry in the world's largest survivor contest, the world's largest legal survivor contest. And this is the first chance we've had to talk about this game because, again, whether it was the week before with Minnesota barely getting by Detroit or this one, and, and by the way, like a tie means you're out. right? And so like, I'm like, oh my God, this game is going to go to a tie, because you mentioned like Geno Smith balling out, and it was like, it's all relative, right? Because like the Steelers are up 14-0, and then the second half starts and you're like, 14 might be good. Like, we might be okay here with just 14. This might be a 14-7 type of a game. And then, yeah, like the Seahawks are able to move the ball, and Pittsburgh can't tackle all of a sudden, because I believe they thought they had won the game already. And it's just a complete horror show the last couple of minutes. And then it's like, all right, we're going to overtime. And then the Steelers, it was the first time in my life I've ever wanted a team to lose the coin toss in overtime, because I'm like, I'd rather Seattle just get the ball, because I believe the Steelers have a better chance of forcing them to punt and give the ball to the Steelers at like the 40-yard line, which then means they only need about 25 to 30 yards to get into at least a long field goal. Because the only guy I have faith in on the Steelers offense is Chris Boswell, and
which is an incredible sentence.
Right? Yeah, right. Who like at one point had the shakes himself a few years back. So like, you know, and then Seattle wins the coin toss. Whatever reason, Russell Wilson's out there calling the coin toss. I've never seen that before. And
I was like, that has to be a penalty or something.
No, like, right. I was like, do we get a free 10 yards to start this overtime? Because like, that's going to come in handy at some point. And then Seattle actually gets a big play, and they're on the brink of field goal position, and then they punt, and then the Steelers, I'm like, the Steelers aren't driving this 50, 60 yards to get into field goal range. And of course they don't, right? They do everything to sort of screw that up, and they punt, and you're like, okay, it's over. And then our sweet angel from above, TJ Watt, comes flying in and forces the fumble. So like, what are my takeaways from that game? Like, I'm glad I never have to see the Steelers again in any meaningful way. Right. And like the idea of them laying points against anybody heretofore going forward. And like, they have a game in a couple of weeks against the Lions. Like, I'm not saying we have to bet the Lions, but I'm saying we have to not bet the Steelers in that game. Like, I'm just glad to sort of never have to deal with it, because there's 32 teams in the NFL, right? And so you can ignore one entirely if you want to, and still have a very active Thursday, Sunday, Monday in your life when it comes to betting the NFL. And that is absolutely my plan with this Steelers team.
I watched that team and I feel so bad for Najee Harris. I'm just like, that guy has to be sore until like the following Saturday. They better not make him practice. They better not make him do anything for the whole week, that his body can just recover, because he's getting just tough yards.
But this poor guy's getting absolutely drilled, and he's not getting any help from any coach, apparently.
Yeah. The lesson here, though, as you mentioned, I'm going to have a tough time taking the Steelers laying points going forward this season.
Never.
So there's the angle there on that one. But a couple games that weren't that back and forth as we thought they might be, but instead they were huge blowouts. The Chargers get pumped by the Ravens, and then the Cards have their way with the Browns. Which result surprised you the most? And, you know, what can we take away from those results going forward?
Yeah, it's funny, right? Like we talk about, and you and I have been talking about this for years, but like the idea of like when you win a bet and you kind of nail it, right? Like the way we did with the Ravens over the Chargers, and the idea of like, okay, Chargers are a really popular underdog. This has driven the line well below where it kind of should be at 3.5. Now it's down to 2.5, et cetera. Got to take the Ravens. And then they end up just blowing out the Chargers. So the whole like, oh, I better get the best of the number thing goes out the window, because they would have covered, you know, a billion different numbers. And it's like, we never kind of go back and be like, yeah, we nailed it. We're right. It's like, okay, we were right. Nothing surprised us. Obviously, we were surprised by how badly the Ravens beat the Chargers, but it was just a terrible spot, right? It was just one of these situations where like, sometimes you just don't have it. And sometimes the fourth down decisions don't necessarily go your way. And they were, going for it on fourth down is never 100%, theory, right? It's reading where you are in the game, who you are playing, and how many points you're going to need, and how badly you need to keep possession. We've talked about that on the positive side for the Chargers, and now we have to talk about it from the negative side. And so, it is what it is. Like, we nailed it. And I said, like, this is either way, I'm probably betting, or leaning towards betting on the Chargers the rest of the season, and nothing changed, right? All that's doing is creating a little value on the Chargers going forward. And I'm obviously completely content with that. As for the Cardinals and the Browns, this is a little bit different. We had a lot of blowouts this week, right? And every other blowout, including the Ravens and Chargers, which is the one other one that maybe you wouldn't necessarily expect, right? We had a lot of covers from like the quote unquote better teams. and relatively easily so. But you go into the box score and you, okay, what happened in this game? How did it get to this point? Obviously, we watch it, and when a team throws an interception, it looks bad, and like the other team is dominant, or when a team scores a touchdown, right? Like we feel that, and we just feel that team is dominant. So there's like 7, I believe, blowouts, right? And every one of those, except for one, had a massive discrepancy in yards per play. And think about it this way: yards per play. It's per play. It's on a per play basis. If you line up against the other team over the course of 60, 70 plays, are you better than them, right? Like, are you doing better offensively than the other team is doing offensively against you? And sometimes this stuff can be skewed and sometimes it's not. But the Cardinals and the Browns very evenly played from a yards per play standpoint, right? When you're in the middle of it and you're watching like Baker Mayfield act like Will Ferrell doing a cat impression with the football, where he's batting it back and forth in his hands, it feels like, and of course the ball is going to come out. Or he throws an interception that wasn't a Cardinals player jumping a route, making a great read. It was Baker just missing the throw by a lot and throwing it right to a guy. Right. And then you can get into the weeds with Carl Sheffard's crew. That was a rough scene, when literally rough, because he's calling roughing the passers on like just some of the most absurd stuff ever. And like the Cardinals. And again, this sounds like I'm bashing the Cardinals, but like, you know, that I like the Cardinals, right? Like we were on them to beat the Rams. We were on them in the first game of the year to beat the Titans. This isn't that, but like, we're responsible for trying to make good bets going forward in the season. Like that is literally my job. So I have to look at this from a more impartial view. And like, if the Cardinals are going to rely on converting a 3rd and 21 into scoring a touchdown that is like a millimeter away from the defensive back, like, it's a great play by Hopkins, but like, that's the play you're going to rely on repeating over and over and over. How is that any different than the Chargers going for it on 4th down every time, right? That's not going to be repeatable every single time. And the play for the Cardinals isn't going to be repeatable. Like Hopkins, like jukes out 4 Browns defenders. Are you going to rely on the Browns defenders looking like, you know, I would say college, but like that's too flattering. Like literally like 8-year-olds, right? Like they didn't even touch him. They had him surrounded and they didn't even touch him. And that's a 3rd down play, I believe. And like that could have been a field goal, right? And so, you know, the Browns made it relatively close, or sort of cosmetically relatively close, by getting a Hail Mary at the end of the first half. So I understand that. But like, if I said to you, like blind resume, like a guy, you know, had 240 yards passing and he had like 6 yards rushing, you know, who was that player? It'd be a while before you guessed Kyler Murray was that player, because he happened to have 4 touchdowns, right? Which isn't really any different than like the Jameis Winston first game of the year, right? It's like, he had 4 or 5 touchdowns. It's like, well, he only had 200 yards passing. And it's like, because they got into, you know, touchdown range, if you will. And that's how they converted those touchdowns. Well, did they run the ball, you know, all over the Browns? No, not necessarily, right? Like they did a little bit, obviously, but it wasn't the reasons that you like the Cardinals going forward. Like Kyler Murray, high flying offense. It's like, no, they turned the Browns over because Baker Mayfield was horrendous in that game. And they got pretty fortunate on a couple of, you know, penalty calls and some high leverage plays that went their way. Like I said, the 3rd and 21, et cetera, right? And so it's like, it's not that I'm not buying into the Cardinals. It's just that they're going to be overrated because they are this flashy sort of concept team, that it was impressive that they won by not necessarily being flashy. But, you know, the Browns are without their two offensive tackles. So that's creating the pressure on Mayfield. We know when Mayfield gets pressure on him, he's a mess. No Nick Chubb, and then Hunt goes out. Like a lot of stuff went badly for the Browns and went well for the Cardinals. And so I can't use much of this going forward to just blindly back the Cardinals in every game they play for the rest of the season. That's just not going to be the case. And I still think that they're probably going to be at, around, or below 500 against the spread the rest of the year, because again, the last 3 weeks, right, all 3 wins against decent teams. Every one of those weeks, they have not been the better team on a yards per play, mano a mano standpoint. And that's concerning.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to look ahead to, and especially when you add in the context of the previous few weeks, because if you remember, last week we were talking about their matchup against the Niners, Trey Lance's first start, and the Niners were in the red zone. The Niners are right there. That could have gone a completely different way. And then how are we viewing the Cardinals? And I get it. And we'll get to the Browns a little later on because they're the Thursday nighter. So we'll definitely talk about them going forward and what, you know, we take away from this past Sunday's game. But you're talking there about the range of the Cards, right? And it makes me kind of think of a couple other teams, just in terms of you're looking at their record and then you're looking at what that means going forward. And kind of the way that you were talking about the Cards, I kind of feel the same way about the Packers, just because it's like, okay, the record's good. Okay, they're winning games. Yeah, we're seeing the highlights of Aaron Rodgers talking trash to the fans and all that, but those games are really, really close and like switching on like one play, but the score makes it look way different than the actual game played out. Do you know what I'm saying? Is that making sense?
Totally, man. Like we saw, like, the Packers are my team, my steady team, right? Because I don't believe that they are quote unquote that good, right? Like I don't have them an 80 out of 100, right? I just have them a steady like 65, 66. Like they're going to be out here, they're going to do what they do, but they're going to perform at that level every single game. Whereas we saw the Chargers, for 3 weeks, we're like, they're playing at a really high level and maybe their average should be 75. But I didn't necessarily buy into that, right? And so we had to kind of keep them in the high 60s, if you will, to sort of use numbers to kind of frame this really well. And the idea is like, they can play to a 75, maybe they can play to an 80, right? That's their range, the top end of their range. But as we saw against the Ravens, they can certainly play into the 60s, the 50s, who knows how you want to sort of describe that, right? Like if you're not giving the Ravens any credit at all, that was certainly a sort of 40s level performance from the Chargers. I give the Ravens some credit, right, in forcing the Chargers to do what they do or do what they did. But like, look at the Chiefs, right? And so whether it's the Chiefs or the Packers, right, those teams cover this week and it almost buys you like 2, 3, 4, maybe with the Chiefs the rest of the season, the idea of like, well, we have to bet on the Chiefs every week because we've talked about their against the spread record being like 1-14 for 15 straight, for 15 week period. And so it's the same thing with the Packers, but like looking at the Chiefs, the first half of that game, you're watching that game and you're going like, we're getting the 60 version of the Chiefs here, right? Like we are getting the really bottom end version. And then at halftime, I don't know, flip switch, use whatever sort of terminology you want there. But in the second half, you're getting the 80, 85 version of the Chiefs. And so it's like in one game, you're getting really the both polar opposites when it comes to the Chiefs, right? So you have to sort of consider on a week to week basis, high range, low range. And then like the Chiefs, you're like, well, any given time, the range goes from really high to really low. So I think the Packers are really tight. I think the Chiefs are kind of frenetic in one game, Chargers and, Browns are another good, a good example. And so if you think the Cardinals, for example, are like playing to the best of their range, which I actually don't think, right? That's the good news for the Cardinals. It's like, as much as I'm sort of worried about the last 3 games and them getting overvalued, like, that also means they might have a better game in them, right? Where they are 2-3 yards per play better than their opponent. So, and that might happen this week because they're, heavily favored against your Houston Texans. And so, that's the concept that you have to sort of understand, especially when you look at these blowouts, right? Because and it's the same thing for the bad teams, right? The Giants can play up to their best of their ability. And now maybe that best of their ability is 40, 45, but sometimes they can play down to it. If again, injury is obviously a factor and matchup is a factor, but like the Giants, for example, were at 25 this week. The Lions were the absolute worst that they could be at a 20 this week. Houston, weren't necessarily as bad. They ran into a Colts team that I think is becoming very interesting this season. And so, whether it's bad team, good team, or mediocre team, these teams, like anybody else, like human beings, right? This podcast, this might be the lower end of my range, right? This might not be my best work. I've certainly probably had better shows. And so like, that's the concept. We all have good days and bad days. And it's sort of simplistic to say, but like, that's part of the deal here with a lot of these teams. But like a guy like Aaron Rodgers will sort of secure things for you and mean, even if your defense isn't playing very well or your offense isn't that great, he will make enough plays to certainly stay within a very tight range of expectation on a week to week basis.
I like that. And you mentioned making plays, and it makes me want to switch gears here to the NCAA, because there's a team from Iowa that wasn't really able to make plays. And they've been relying on a bunch of big plays so far this season in their crazy run so far. But they were upset by Purdue. My question to you is, does this really end Iowa's chances at making the college football playoff? if you had one of those futures there?
Yeah, bad news for our crew out in Iowa, and God knows we love our gang out in Iowa. Unfortunately, that's the case, right? Like that's the situation. And listen, it was going to get trickier too for Iowa down the stretch here. And again, they play on a razor's edge, right, where they don't have an explosive element to their game. And we just talked about like the idea of like it's 2021, whether it's NFL football or college football, right? Like it isn't, the defense stopping you and all of that sort of thing. Like that's not really how football works anymore. And so Iowa is playing this really unique style that, if things go right and if they're able to turn, the other team over like they did against Indiana or Iowa State, like that's fine. And then if Penn State's quarterback, for example, gets hurt, right, they're able to then lock it down and Penn State can't score anymore. And eventually Iowa is going to get enough points just on sort of field position and like a player here, two here or there. But they got thoroughly beat by Purdue. Purdue is a more explosive offensive team, right? They had guys running free in the secondary. They were able to hit on big plays. And that was the difference in that game. And that's the thing where it's like, okay, we can get all caught up in the standings. And like, I never look at the standings because the standings are an indicator of what's happened in the past. And what we need to do as bettors is look towards the future. And when you look at Iowa, you just go, I just don't know how sustainable this necessarily is. And there are going to be matchups that don't necessarily work out for them. That was one here in this case that I added myself on Saturday, had a little money line to it too. And I know that that's not a brag by any means because we didn't get that out into the podcast in time, which is unfortunate, but, and a bad call on my part by sort of not, cluing into this sort of really troublesome matchup for Iowa, later on in the week. But it's like, you can't ever be surprised when a team like that plays these games in the teens and in the early 20s, that sometimes it just might not go their way. And that was the case for Iowa. And of course they fall out of contention, I think, here for the college football playoff.
As we go to teams who are in contention for the college football playoff, Bama bounces back in a big way. Georgia is just putting in work. But Kentucky covers, which is interesting because it's still me viewing Kentucky. I'm always going to view them as a basketball school, obviously. So to see them good is like, see them spicy in college football is like, okay. Yeah. But SEC, what's going on there just with those two teams and they're just continued dominance here.
And right, like, speaking of things that are quote unquote obvious or whatever, but you get a little bit scared away by a 17-point spread, like Alabama bouncing back. We talked about the idea of, the Mike Leach spread offense being kind of the perfect offense for the Alabama defense to bounce back with, right? Because that ball is coming. If you have any sort of scouting whatsoever, you're going to be able to read a fair amount of those plays in advance, and that's going to cause turnovers. And Will Rogers, of course, is just throwing the ball to Alabama. Not even really his fault, right? Because he is supposed to make these certain throws that Alabama knows are coming, and that turns into an absolute bleep kicking on Saturday. Georgia, it's just, you watch the team and you're like, I tweeted this out. I was like, honestly, I don't know. Like, we do the thing, could like Georgia beat, an NFL team, or like when there's a really good team, or like you need probably better offense if you're Georgia to beat an NFL team, and they would never anyway. And so my point was like, okay, I don't know that Georgia's defense is better than an NFL defense, but if you literally just change the uniforms with like the Chiefs, if you just put them in Chiefs uniforms and sent them out there all 1 through 11 and the depth that they have in the front seven, it's not going to look any different, right? Like it might be like, oh, who's the bad defense on that NFL team? And you would be like, a bunch of college kids. Like, we didn't tell you, but we switched Georgia's defense with Kansas City's defense just to see how it would look. And like, it looks not great, but like, it doesn't look like they're not an NFL defense because that's the dudes that they have on that team. And so, we talk Tuesdays a lot of time about like, what's the bad beat of the week? And, we were that easily for us, that was the Patriots game. Mm-hmm. If this was sort of the bad win, Kentucky calling timeout for one last play, being able to jam the ball into the end zone. And you know what, speaking of insane though, is, we talked about this game and on Friday's show, and Kentucky, you said like 21.5 points. Like, is that too many or whatever? And I was like, well, it was too many at 23.5, the way it was early on in the week. right?
Yep.
And I'm like, and we watched, and between Tuesday, for example, and Friday, we saw the number go from 23.5 to 21. And like this, and this, I was going to call it the NFL betting, but like this football betting thing, man, like how it's sitting on 23 points in the last bit, where if you had if you'd taken the 23.5 early on in the week, you're like, I don't even care if they score this touchdown. Like it doesn't matter to me. But if you're like me, you got a little compassion for people kind of showing up late, maybe on a Sunday, you're like 21.5, good enough, because who thinks the game's going to land 22 and 23, right? Like that just doesn't make, a lot of sense, or it doesn't seem like a high probability situation. So like that was really nice for everybody who backed Kentucky, because that game was competitive, 14-7 at half and all of that sort of thing. But it's incredible, right? The 23.5 down to 21.5, and it's sitting at 23 on the final drive for Kentucky. You're wondering if they're just going to kick a field goal. Like we're this close, I think, honestly, and this is a sort of a bigger sort of picture thing, but like we are this close to teams doing that, to kicking field goals, because they absolutely know the number and they don't want to risk not punching it in for the touchdown. Because all they would have needed, right, was a field goal to get that to a 20-point game. And honestly, who cares if it's a 20-point game or a 17-point game, right? Like what difference does that make, as long as you're covering for the fan base, for the alumni, et cetera, right? That's how, like, we're getting very close to that being a regular thing within a couple years, I think.
Something that maybe some people might be hoping is a regular thing was your man's Caleb Williams getting some action here. And it kind of segues us nicely into the Heisman watch.
Yeah.
Caleb Williams looked really good, but talk to me about your update this week, because we've been talking about a few different names for the last few weeks, and that continues to develop.
Yeah. So our portfolio includes Desmond Ridder from before the season, 60-1, right? And the idea being like, if there are no standout, that much better than everybody else type players, if Cincinnati can even just be undefeated, and maybe that means that they get into the college football playoff, maybe that doesn't, but we didn't want to bet them to win the national title because they're just not going to beat Georgia and they're not going to beat Alabama. Now I'm starting to waver a little bit on that concept, because that's how good Cincinnati is looking these days. That being said, right, like that still stands to reason that maybe if they're undefeated, Desmond Ridder gets sort of an MVP type candidacy, right? Whereas numbers aren't necessarily as good as, a traditional Heisman trophy winner would be, but if there's no other real awesome competition, and Bryce Young and Matt Corral, they're just still sitting there as the top two favorites, but like honestly, the most vulnerable Heisman favorites I think you can possibly find. So we're sitting there with Desmond Ridder. We're sitting there with Bijan Robinson, who again, Texas loses again this week and blows another game that they were winning comfortably, 17-3. They're going in for another score and they throw a pick six, and all of a sudden the landslide happens and Oklahoma State somehow stays undefeated. That was brutal for Texas backers. But Bijan Robinson's got Gus Johnson yelling like, see you in New York, right? Yeah. Like, New York, get ready. Bijan Robinson's going to be there. And it's just like, yeah, like that's the stuff you need, right? You need hype. And if Gus Johnson's going to be the hype man, like there are worse hype mans than Gus Johnson, right? And hype men, I guess. Problem is, right, if the team keeps losing games and they keep, not being able to salt away second halves, fourth quarters of these games, then there's going to be obviously sort of a downturn on the Bijan Robinson, hype train, if you will. And then our guy, Kenny Pickett, we talked about him, 40-1. He's up to 21-1 from a touchdown to interception ratio, by far the best in the country. Big, comfortable win against Virginia Tech last week. And they get Clemson this coming week, right? Which is another sort of feature presentation type game. And if he can have a nice game and a victory, they are favored, by the way. Pitt is favored over Clemson. That's the world we live in. And it's not even insane, right? Yeah. If they can do well there. But the wild card is, as you mentioned, right? Caleb Williams comes in and he's Anthony Richardson, right? Like we talked about Anthony Richardson for Florida, thinking he would come into the game against Alabama, and he doesn't, because Florida hung just enough in that game to be able to, keep him at bay. He had a, hamstring, groin injury or whatever it was. And now, of course, by the way, like Anthony Richardson comes in against LSU and is like electric, and he's probably going to now start the rest of the way for the Gators. Problem is, the Gator season is over, and now you have Caleb Williams coming in, and who would have thought? Spencer Rattler, like a favorite for the Heisman. Everybody's awesome in the Oklahoma offense. except for Spencer Rattler, apparently, as he's so bad that, he loses the job halfway through the season. And so now the Heisman watch includes Williams, who's sitting there kind of reopened here at 20-1. And it's just a matter of, do you think you can give the Heisman to a player who showed up halfway through the season? Because if it's just based on performance and just based on stats, again, everybody but Spencer Rattler can put up stats. Jalen Hurts, Baker Mayfield, Kyler Murray, et cetera, et cetera. So he's going to put up the stats. We just watched him do it against TCU, right? And if he does that for 6 more games, and they're undefeated, and we've been looking for the star quarterback, right? For the star quarterback putting up numbers, taking a team to the college football playoff. Oklahoma's undefeated. And the one thing that was keeping other teams in games against them was the quarterback play. Well, if that's just not going to be the case, the problem is, are we overreacting to one game against TCU? Maybe we are, but at the same time, right? It's really just going to come down to, can these voters, of which there are so many of them, right? This isn't 30 people making a call here. This is 3,000 people or whatever it is making a call here. How many of them are going to be willing to say, okay, he only played half the season, but that's good enough for us because he absolutely racked up stats and they're going to the college football playoff. It's a Heisman Trophy watch that was kind of boring, and we were trying to take advantage of its boringness, has just gotten absolutely off the rails here with Caleb Williams getting into the mix.
Speaking of getting into the mix, I love getting into the mix to our mid-week picks. Hey,
let's do it.
I got bars. NCAA action here. Let's start with Coastal Carolina -4 at Appalachian State.
Yeah, midweek App State, right? This is a thing that just exists in our lives every single week, and we fade them, and then we win money, right? Whether it was Marshall +7, that was a funny game on that Thursday night a few weeks ago, and then we had Louisiana last week. Yeah. And we were sitting there going I don't understand, not even necessarily why Louisiana is not favored. How is this a pick 'em? How is this not a pick 'em? How is this up to 3.5 going up to 5? All of this made absolutely no sense to me. So you know what we did? We bet Louisiana, and you know what they did? They beat the brakes off of App State because we don't think App State is very good. Now Coastal Carolina comes to town, and this line, it was crazy. This thing opened in Las Vegas at pick 'em. I think even App State might have been -1. And everybody looked around and said, are you not paying attention? This App State team is not very good. And now we're looking at -4. So it's one of those things where you look at it and you go, man, that pick'em would have been nice, right? It's we did kind of miss out. And listen, how many people were able to get that? Did you have to be in line at the hotel to be able to get that money? Did that ever come anywhere near any sort of offshore, North American book? Yeah. I don't think it necessarily did. Right. And so we've watched this thing move up to -3, -4. I'm certainly not betting App State, right? That's just not I can't be well, I don't think App State's very good all season long and then be all of a sudden okay, it's time to hit App State. That said, home underdog weeknight against a massive, big team in the conference in Coastal Carolina. It does feel like a situation that normally we would get ourselves involved in. So unfortunately, a lot of the value sucked out of that game on Wednesday because it's a Wednesday game. And I'd love to bet it and get locked in on a little Sunbelt action, little Fun Belt Wednesday. But again, value sucked right out of that game, and now you're laying points with a team on the road, and that's not necessarily what I'm looking to do with my Wednesday.
Talking about laying points with the team on the road, Louisiana Lafayette -18 at Arkansas State. Woo!
And this is it, right? This is the fun of this. This is the fun of the Fun Belt, right? This is the fun of the Sun Belt. It's okay, we recall Coastal Carolina at Arkansas State having the big number, right? It was 14, something along those lines, and being you know what? Arkansas State's garbage. I'm going to lay this number. Yeah. Not as likely to lay it this week. And here's why. Last time we were okay, Arkansas State, we talked about the travel that they had and that they're coming home, and they're probably just going to be completely wiped out for this game against a Coastal Carolina team that could absolutely run it up on them. Louisiana can run it up, but they just came off of that win against App State, right? That's a pretty high, if we're talking ranges, right? It works the same in college. College kids have a lot wider of a range than NFL teams do. It's never going to be as good as Louisiana just beating the brakes off of App State last week. And they can sort of take this game off and still win this game comfortably. Whereas Arkansas State, it's never going to be as bad as the last time we faded Arkansas State, where they won or they lost, by a billion. Mm-hmm. So if I absolutely had to here, we're talking about an 18-point home underdog. I think I would take Arkansas State here and just absolutely hold my nose and hope this turns into like a 35-21, 38-21 type of game where, like, again, Arkansas State capable of getting the last touchdown. And that might be that situation, right? Where they are down 24 points and they punch in a late touchdown to get this thing under the number. That's the only way I would play it, because again, this is just a tough spot for Louisiana Lafayette, laying 18 points on the road against anybody in the Sun Belt.
So let's keep things moving here, as there's a couple more bets we want to get to. Florida Atlantic -7 at Charlotte.
Yeah, this number a little bit too high for me. Not something that I'm dying to get involved in, but if I absolutely had to, Charlotte +7 would be the play there. Florida Atlantic, little schizophrenic, if you will, this season. And so, just laying 7 on the road with Florida Atlantic is not something I want to do in that one. There's a couple other Thursday games I'll get to really, really quickly here before we get into the main course, if you will. Tulane and SMU. They can score. They can put these points up, and I'm not sure that Tulane can. I would actually probably take SMU here -13.5 to giving the 2 touchdowns there. But the underdog of this whole crew that I actually feel good about, as weird as this is to say, San Jose State play is -4.5 on the road to UNLV, and San Jose State's getting some credit here for playing tough with San Diego State. That is a undefeated somehow San Diego State team last week at home, but like that game was grim. That game was like 6-6 type of a football game here. UNLV hung right in there last week. They've got a giant slot machine on the sideline. Like, you've heard of the turnover chain and like the, touchdown axe, or like whatever all these teams are doing. UNLV has a slot machine, a big one on the sideline. Like, how much fun is that? I think they are live to win this game on Thursday. UNLV is certainly a play that I'm going to be making, with maybe the little money line sprinkle as well. A little slot machine action for ourselves. Maybe we get lucky pulling the one-arm bandit on that one.
Love it. And of course, there's more on Thursday night for us to deep dive into. But before I get your take, don't forget to head to drf.com/sports for all the betting angles and power trends. And of course, the NFL previews from our guy, Scott Gramling, who writes ahead of this Broncos and Browns matchup on Thursday night. Comes with this little bit of fire stat here. It says, Cleveland is 3-8 as favorites against the spread over the past calendar year, which includes 0-7 against the spread when favored over an AFC opponent.
Okay.
Right? I'm kind of like, whoa, okay. That is a statistic. But as we look ahead to this Thursday nighter, Broncos at Browns. Browns are favored by 3.5 points. The over-under is set at 42.5, but to me, that stat is incredible, and I was already leaning Broncos just because I think the Browns are just beat up, and Baker, we get it, you're hurt. You see my guy show up to the presser. He's got the huge sling on, and it's like, we get it, you're hurt, my dude. Cool. Sit out then if you're that hurt, right?
Yeah.
But either way, short week. I mean, I can't like the Browns in this game, can I?
Nobody seems to, right? Like, this opened 5 and is now down to 3.5 with like extra juice on the underdog. So we're headed for 3, I think. And I think that makes sense because, again, we talk like underdogs, favorites, et cetera. And like a lot of times we're afraid of the favorite, right? We don't want to deal with the underdog because we're afraid of the favorite. What am I supposed to be afraid of when it comes to the Browns at this point? Now, again, a lot of this comes down to the injury report. We'll start with Baker. I actually rather Baker play than Case Keenum. Honestly, like at this point,
no,
like,
I'm with you.
right? Like Case Keenum, I think right this second is a better quarterback for what the Browns usually want to do. Now, I say usually want to do, and that means, there's a very prominent podcast out there that calls it chunting, right? Chubb and Hunt, right? If neither of those guys go, Hunt is definitely not going to go. Chubb didn't play on Sunday, and so he may be banged up. So we might have like multiple sling guys, if you will, out there. And to me, the more important are the offensive line injuries for the Browns, right? Like, what am I afraid of when it comes to the Browns? If Jarvis Landry, Nick Chubb, Kareem Hunt, and healthy Baker Mayfield are not involved in this game, and the offensive line, which is like what makes that team go, right? And that's the unfortunate part. As much as we talked about the Browns, and the Cardinals being, from a per play basis, predictive going forward, like a little bit closer than the score indicated. The reason that game wasn't close was because Baker Mayfield was getting his shoulder mangled because his offensive line couldn't protect him. Well, that's not going to work against the Denver Broncos. And kudos to you. And the good news in all of this is we didn't lead with Teddy Bridgewater as an underdog stats, right? Like, that's normally how all of this stuff begins. But we've been anti Teddy Bridgewater the last few weeks because he's been a favorite, right? It hasn't fit the Teddy Bridgewater trend here. Well, guess who's back? Back again. Teddy's back to cover a point spread as an underdog, right? With his, outstanding ability to do so. Like,
you're supposed to finish that with "tell your friends."
I haven't technically finished my thought. So, spoiler alert: tell your friends. You know what I mean? So, like, this is how Teddy Bridgewater works, right? It's like nobody believes that he can win the game, and he barely does or doesn't, right? And so, like, what am I afraid of when it comes to the Browns? It's certainly not the defense. And you know what? The Broncos ran into a Raiders team. We always talk about range, talk about motivation, talk about embarrassment being the best motivation for a professional team. Yeah. They were embarrassed by their coach. They were embarrassed by their performance the week before against the Bears. And they came out in that Denver Broncos game like a house on fire. The Raiders were going, again, hindsight 2020, et cetera, right? But like, that was an emotional high in that game in Mile High. And now it's travel, second road game, short week. Like, none of that stuff is necessarily it's going to create some value on the Broncos, right? It's like they're going on the road. They've got a short week. They just got smoked by the Raiders. And that's why this number opened 5. But when you actually look at the injury report, listen, the Broncos aren't clean from an injury report standpoint either, but it doesn't have the same cluster effect where you're getting into the 6th, 7th, and 8th best offensive linemen playing. So injury report, really important in this game. I would just go money line. Honestly, I would wait. Maybe this goes down to 3, 2.5. I think that'll be a really good indicator, if you will, about what the sort of injury levels are here when it comes to the Browns. Don't be afraid. Maybe if Baker Mayfield gets ruled in, they might actually get more credit, and the line might get to a sort of cleaner 3.5. I'm all for that. Like, let Baker play. Right. And so, I'm Broncos or nothing here. Definitely some money line here as well on the Broncos, who we can now get back in on buying after having to sell for a few weeks.
Shouts to Teddy Two Gloves for sure. Matt, thanks as always for coming through and blessing me with this Tuesday therapy session that I definitely needed. As we try and get back to some winning ways, though, this upcoming week/weekend, where can the people find you online on social media?
Yeah, at MRuss Authentic, right? Everything gets tweeted through there. My stuff that I do with the score, sometimes even tweet out the comment section a little bit, which is always a riot. And everything that we do here. And you know what? Just breaking stuff down, sometimes in a very sarcastic way, sometimes in a very confused way. But that's the deal when it comes to football betting, right? Where you just sort of shrug your shoulders sometimes and go like, oh, come on. And that is life. And so whether it's Steelers sweat or Patriots disappointment, that's what we do over on the Twitter box.
Thanks as always, my dude. Appreciate it. Talk to you soon.
Pleasure, brother. Anytime.
Thanks to Matt for coming on the pod. And if you want to follow me online, you can do so on Instagram at Sheldon Alexander and on Twitter at Shell Alexander. Also, check out our recent NBA season betting preview pod, where you get all the inside info on the futures markets, everything from title odds to who's going to win each division, where we're searching for value in MVP bets, coach of the year, rookie of the year, all that and so much more. Remember to like and subscribe to the DRF Sports Podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. And for more on this brand new project from DRF Sports, another reminder, if you're not familiar with the letters DRF, well, daily racing form. has been around for over 100 years, giving you all of the horse racing information, data, and analysis. But now we're taking over the entire sports world. So if you want coverage on every football game, as well as the NBA, MLB, and more, head to drf.com/sports for all the details and insights, as the site has all the data on every game, including offensive and defensive stats, betting angles, line movements, key injuries, and head-to-head records. The DRF data is what powers our power trends. So if you want to see which trends our analysts have selected, follow us on Instagram and on Twitter. But if you want access to all the raw data, drf.com/sports. That's where our usual previews are. Plus, we go in depth on this podcast. However you want your betting information, we've got you covered. As always, my name is Sheldon Alexander. Thanks for tuning in. It's all we got for now. But until next time, see ya.
Thanks for listening to the DRF Sports Podcast. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show. For more sports betting advice, go to drf.com/sports and follow on Twitter at DRF_sports.